Thank you for joining us this evening for tonight's NoVA UX Meetup August event. My name is Jim Lane. I'm joined this evening by co-organizer Alex Shao, Jody Thomas sends her regards. She's not able to join us this month. For those who are not familiar with the group, if you're first time joining us, NoVA UX is a meetup group for UX professionals in the Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. metro areas, although we have members joining us from lots of other places, sometimes even overseas. Our group has been hosting monthly talks and workshops since NoVA UX was founded in 2012, and we are delighted that you all could join us this evening. Before I introduce tonight's talk, let's take care of a few housekeeping details. As I mentioned, this event's being recorded. It will be posted later on our YouTube channel, so NoVA UX Meetup on YouTube. Sometimes there's a bit of a lag time between when the videos get posted, but if you go to the channel, you'll see tons of videos from previous years there. If you have questions for Jayesh this evening, please post them in the chat channel. Alex and I will be keeping an eye on the chat. And greetings from Northern New Jersey. Fantastic, welcome. We'll be keeping an eye on that. And then we will do Q&A at the end of Jayesh's talk. So please ask lots of great questions and we'll get through as many as we have time. We'll probably shoot to wrap about 8 o'clock or so. But we'll figure that out as we get there. If you would like to share your thoughts about tonight's talk or about the group on social media, our Twitter accounts are on the slide in front of you. JS's is at JSRIV. Hope I got that right. And then the group's handle is NoVA UX Meetup. Jody's is Jody with a Y. Alex is Perfect with a PH. And mine is Jim Lane Nova. So please post away if you like and share your thoughts. We'd love to see the social media engagement. So with no further ado, welcome to NoVA UX, Jayesh. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
Excellent. So Jayesh has worked at CNN with Alex and I for a while. And he's going to tell us a little bit about his work there and about design thinking and with the rest of the organization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off, hand the floor to you, Jayesh, and we will go from there. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so you can share your screen.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Alex, for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to you today about growing design thinking in an organization. So I'm just gonna, as much as I thought I'd given up making slides, I think often slides are a good way to communicate things. So I made some slides for tonight, but please feel free to add any questions in the chat and then ask me afterwards also. So I'm just gonna share my screen and that's great. So today I wanted to talk to you about the work that I've been doing and several others at CNN have been doing, which is looking to grow design thinking in an organization. This is the mission that I joined CNN for, and this is also the work that I used to do in a previous life when I was in the consulting world. We would work with various clients and try to foster a culture of innovation and try to get more folks familiar with design thinking methods. And so I got to do that across different industries and even different sizes of organizations. And I'd love to share with you some of my thoughts on it. And I'd love to hear your feedback afterwards too about what you think about it and the experiences that you've had in doing similar work. So let's get to it. There we go. So this is my just a quick profile. My name is Jayesh. I work in design strategy within the core news team at CNN. I'm based out of New York City. I'm coming to you live from the East Village. Currently, I'm working on bringing design strategy across core news. So how we can start to think about user needs in all of the products we build and how we can balance business objectives with what the users want from us and need from us, and with what opportunities exist in the marketplace, and really doing that overlap between desirability, feasibility, and viability that I'm sure many of us in the audience are familiar with, but really making that second nature to all of the products that we build and all of the processes that we typically use. So here's a quick picture of me staring at some equations that always makes us look smart. So I decided to put that in. And then the brief that I am working with currently and have done before, which is building a culture of design thinking in a large and successful organization. And this is relevant because the fact that we are large and the fact that we are successful can both be hindrances in changing culture, because what we've been doing in the past has been successful. And I've had this experience also in past organizations that I've worked in, where doing things the traditional way has delivered a lot of success. So there's naturally a lot of resistance to trying things a different way. And also the larger the organization, the more nodes there are that you have to speak to and interact with and build consensus with. And it requires more of a marathon approach where you slowly build some pockets of change and then transform culture one step at a time, as opposed to working at a small startup where you can all maybe get trained in the same work and then kind of use one philosophy. Okay, excellent. So what I like to do with all of the work that I've done in my career is apply the design process. I know that we have a room full of very good designers and then also folks who are design enthusiasts. So even if you don't come from a design background, I'm sure you're familiar with this double diamond process. Here's just a Google search result of what you would get if you put in the double diamond innovation process or product development process. And I'm sure everyone here has seen some version of this and used some version of this. And the work that I like to do applies this to various problems, and the problems can be really varied. I started out my career as an industrial designer, working on physical products, and it was interesting because the work there was very similar conceptually, but very different in terms of our outputs. We were building barbecues and lawnmowers and so on. And then I got to apply that same process to more and more abstract things, to now where I exist kind of in the middle of the product teams and the design teams, where I help the product and design teams get a better understanding of where there are opportunities in the marketplace and where our users have unmet needs, so that what we end up building is really driven by identifying good user needs, and that it increases our chances of having good product market fit. So when I was hired for this job, and even in previous roles, I decided to apply this very same design process to building a culture of design thinking within our organization. And I'll talk through what that means step by step. So this is, again, the double diamond expanded a little bit more. And as we typically do, there's a phase of exploratory research at the beginning, or some sort of discovery phase, it's often called, excuse me, where we are trying to understand the problems, we are trying to understand our users better. We're just trying to get our bearings as to what the potential scope of solutions might be, what the potential problems we might be solving could be. And then from that, we get into problem definition, where we start describing more specifically and more precisely what we're going to be solving. And as all good designers know, this is a really crucial step, actually, because often what you think you're solving for changes when you do problem definition, or you're given a new piece of information, or you uncover more insights that really help you reframe the problem that you thought you were solving at the beginning. And that can be very helpful in making it easier to come up with solutions. So once you've defined the problem a lot more clearly, then you get into ideation, of course, and then you come up with lots of solutions that typically would then be tested out. What I like to do, and the kind of work that I've done in the past, is taken a so-called portfolio approach to the solutions. So to any problem that we're working on, we come up with lots of ideas. And as we all know, it takes a lot of iteration to figure out a good solution or figure out if your solution has the product market fit that you were looking for. And so that means that in some cases, your idea will take a few iterations and then will be successful and you can launch it. In other cases, it might take a few iterations and you end up with an idea that isn't successful or didn't end up doing what you expected it to, or your users rejected it. And that's fine too. That's still a learning experience for you. And in other cases, sometimes an idea doesn't require a lot of iteration to get to be a success. So here you can see that visually represented as those rocket ships of successful ideas, and then an X when it's not a successful idea, or you need to go back to the drawing board, and then all of the iterations that you need to do. And if you have a portfolio of these, if you have lots of different things you're trying, there's a higher expectation of success overall, but then the amount of things you learn are also much greater because you're trying many different solutions to a very broad problem. So I'll go into a little bit of more detail when that comes to looking at it from a corporate setting. So first, we do exploratory research. I just looked for a picture of ethnography, and because of the fact that ethnography often comes from an anthropology background, there's a lot of pictures of safaris. And I thought it was interesting to frame the exercise of learning about the insides of a corporation as if you're going into a safari, because there might be wild animals, there might be things you don't know, your safety might be in danger. So it makes it a lot more exciting than just the real fact of interviewing corporate folks. But yeah, so we always do exploratory research at the beginning. For us, we wanted to understand who our users would be. So the users that we are working with, our goal for them was to understand design thinking and apply design thinking to their everyday work. And within a company like CNN, there are many groups of people whom we wish to start adopting design thinking. Some of those are more obvious than others. So our users would be obviously folks in the product space, those who build our apps and those who are responsible for our websites. Obviously, we are a media organization, so folks in the editorial space are also going to be users. We wanted them to start adopting design thinking principles in the way that they thought about their work. They're also recognizing the fact that we are an ad-supported business. Sales are a big component of how our products are designed. So helping our sales teams and folks who work in that area understand better how they can apply design thinking to the work that they do. And then our research arm, so we've got a lot of research capabilities and lots of folks who work there, and helping them see how research that they provide helps us understand users better and therefore build products for unmet user needs. And then people who work on the data side as well. So it's not just that we are using our data scientists, so to speak, to tell us whether an A/B test should go one way or another, but we're involving them in the whole process and helping them understand this iterative way of working so that we keep trying new iterations of the ideas and also help them use our data better. And then, of course, our platforms team. So even folks who are not directly connected to what our viewers and listeners and so on see, they should also have an understanding of taking this approach to doing platform innovation. And then finally, leadership, because we need their buy-in and we also need them to see the value of doing things in this iterative fashion. So this is the typical way that we do exploratory research. We just use the tools in our designer's toolbox. That involves things like interviews. So when I first started, I have a collection of interviews that I did, and I believe it was about 48 interviews with various stakeholders across all of those groups that I mentioned previously. So that spanned the organization from the more obvious product folks who I'd be working with closely day to day, but then also expanded out to folks who I wouldn't be interacting with necessarily that often, but I still wanted to know what their expectations were, what their user journeys were. And then at any corporate setting or in any corporate setting, there are lots of stories and opinions. So part of this information gathering is really getting close with lots of different people who have been around a long time, so that they can tell you about past attempts at doing things a certain way and how that worked out. And they can also tell you about the internal culture, so you can learn a little bit more about where things can get difficult, or how it's best to get ideas to succeed, and so on. Then there's participant observation. It seems a little flippant to call our coworkers participants, but I think that's ultimately, when we're trying to build something for them, they are participants, and it's important for us to see how they do their day-to-day jobs, and how we can help them get into a design thinking process. And then finally, as we accumulate experience in the company, you get personal experience about how projects are typically run, and where things work really well, and where there might be some opportunities for making things better. So all of these, again, are traditional design methods, just applied to an organizational scale. And then next, this is what I always do when I'm doing user research. So my background before my last job was that I was a behavioral scientist. So I studied how we can change user behavior, and how we can get people to do the things that they want to do, but have difficulty doing. Like, we all want to eat better, we all want to sleep more, we all want to not be addicted to Netflix, etc. And one of the frameworks that is really simple in explaining how you can change user behavior is the BJ Fogg model, which looks a little bit complicated here, but it's really straightforward. Basically, there are two axes. One has to do with motivation, low motivation and high motivation. The other axis has to do with ability, so something that's easy to do versus hard to do. And then there's a third element of prompts. But even if you just look at those two axes, it's logical in that if you want somebody to be able to do a new behavior, you know that you have to increase their motivation for doing it. So they have to want to do it. And it has to be easy to do. So things that are really hard to do need a lot of motivation to get you to try and then do repeatedly. Things that are easy to do don't require a lot of motivation, because they're so easy that it's much more expected, or it's much more common for the person to actually do it. And then prompts are things that are like triggers that you can give people to encourage them. So how can you remind them at the right time to do a new behavior? And for our case, the behavior is getting folks to use design thinking methods, getting folks to start thinking in a user-centric way about product development. That's the new behavior that we want them to take on. And I wanted to see, what are their motivators? What makes them motivated to try new things? And what do they perceive as being easy to do and hard to do? And you can see how this would lead you to start categorizing different parts of the organization, or different types of individuals, into potentially personas and so on, where you can start mapping specific motivations and also what they perceive as their ability. And that leads me to this. So we create user archetypes, which are a type of persona, but they're much more based on user motivation than they are on just describing what they do. It's the why they do what they do, rather than just saying they tend to behave a certain way, and then mapping out user journeys. So we would want to do that for all of the users whom we're building for in this organization. You could broadly start talking about different groups, and we list things like their attitudes, their behaviors, the barriers and pain points, and their use cases. So when do they have opportunities to use design thinking methods? When do they have an opportunity to think about what they're doing from a user-centric point of view? And then also what's holding them back from trying it? And what do they do today? And what are their habits today? Because typically someone's current habits are the best indicator of what would be a good future habit for them. So by seeing what they find easy to do today and habituate to, you can try and mold what you're trying to get them to do to be similar to it. And then once we have an idea of who our users are, what motivates them, what makes them tick, we then, of course, get into problem definition. And we have how might we statements, which are again the designer's best friend when it comes to ideation. So for us, it was very specific around how might we increase motivation for users for learning about and applying design thinking to their work. And then we also wanted it to be easy to do. So that came up in how might we minimize obstacles to learning about and applying design thinking. And then finally, how might we create opportunities for practicing design thinking? So how might we get people interested in this new process? How might we make it easier for them to apply the new process? And also, how might we hold space for people to practice this new process? And then we get into the sticky notes phase, which every designer is familiar with. We get into ideation. So we've defined our how might we statements and our problem. And then we do all of our creative design work, which is scheming, plotting, and strategizing. So I've used very strong terms, but basically it's ideation and concept generation. And so what I did when I first started was I spoke to folks in leadership. I spoke to folks who were new hires and also folks who were thought leaders within the organization to come up with potential ways that we could apply design thinking to our existing projects and also ways that we could spread design thinking throughout the organization. So the leadership buy-in was, of course, really important because it was important to collaborate with the folks who are going to be making the decisions about how projects are run and how resources would be allocated. And if they had a part to play in getting teams to work differently, it was much likelier that that would actually work. Then I wanted to talk to new hires because they often are have the freshest perspective because they're coming in also really enthusiastic about doing things differently and doing things a new way. And they haven't yet gotten sort of cynical about things being difficult to accomplish. And so I wanted to use their creativity also to come up with ways that we could spread design thinking through the organization. And then, of course, thought leaders. So the folks who are spending a lot of time thinking about these types of things and really are passionate about finding new ways to change organizational behavior, and also are folks who are listened to. So they know how to present this work so that it travels really well. So we came up with lots of different solutions of how we could spread design thinking. And we had lots of different concepts. So there are things that are a little bit obvious, like L&D workshops. So myself and my colleague, Lindsay Abrams, we worked together on running this design strategy summer camp this summer, which was an L&D process, basically, where every week we would have a podcast where we talked about one aspect of the design thinking process and talked to experts. We even spoke to Jim on one of our episodes about how they applied it to their work within CNN. And then we also did workshops where people who attended got a chance to apply this to a practical problem. And they got to see what it was like to interview users and to try and figure out what their pain points were and to try and ideate really creatively and also to prototype and get feedback. So that was really helpful. Then we also looked at doing internal programs and external products. So we started building out specific projects where it would be done using a design thinking method. So I can't obviously speak about them specifically, but there were, what I did was identify a few products that were about to be redesigned or there was an opportunity to rethink them. And instead of our traditional process that we would have used, we did a design sprint that lasted 8 weeks. And we did a much more thorough deep dive into user needs, understanding our consumers and identifying pain points along their journey, and then doing more ideation and concept testing. So all of these were different ways of getting people to, one, learn about these processes, learn the terminology, hear about it in short podcasts. It was also a way for people to try it out in different ways. So they could try it out in the workshops, or if they were part of a cross-functional team that was part of a design thinking project, they got to apply it and work on it full time for several weeks. Or if we talked them through certain trainings. They also got to learn about it that way. And so for most of these things, as I said at the beginning, we wanted to have a portfolio approach of different types of solutions that we were doing simultaneously in order to have the greatest success. And for all of them, it's helpful to think about the optimization of impact versus risk, because you also don't want to start with a project that is potentially very risky, even if it'll have a lot of impact, because then there's a lot of attention on that project being successful and everybody having a very good experience. And as we all know, as designers, things are unpredictable. Things are often outside of your control. And you don't want to be working on something that's high risk as your first go around. Whereas you also don't want to be working on something that won't have very much impact. So it just ends up making a barely noticeable change. And so, or doesn't have a lot of folks involved with it, because then there's nothing really to talk about. And we haven't done a good job of spreading the design thinking culture across the organization. And things in the middle can be also successful because they become sort of examples for other teams. So if a small team goes through this process and does it really well, we're also doing share outs, we're also talking about it constantly. And that gets other people in the company interested, and also wanting to learn about these methods and tools and so on. So yeah, just as I was saying, we kind of ran each of these initiatives like a mini startup of, we've got a mission, we have to accomplish either a redesign of a product or identify some new opportunities in a space, or we want to come up with some ideas for a new medium of content. And the team is going to be hyper focused on getting that solution. So rather than being on many different projects at once, we tried to get as much dedicated time as possible from a smaller group of people. And we ran it like a mini startup. Like, if our goal is to launch X product by the end of this 12-week period, then let's act as if that's our company, and we need to make sure that we don't run out of funding by the end of it. So there was a lot of focus on taking it very seriously, and also doing our best at understanding our user and doing our best at coming up with the best solution that we could think of. And then in order to spread our success or spread this knowledge further, we made sure to do as many share outs as we possibly could without annoying people. So I think it's always very helpful to have progress updates where you can invite more people than are involved with the day-to-day work. And it keeps them updated. It helps you get more feedback. So, excuse me, you learn about what people are perceiving about the work, and you can also get really good ideas of how you can make it more effective. We also had road shows. So after we finished one of the projects, we created a package for presenting it to groups that were totally new. So if someone wanted to know more about a project that we had done because they'd heard about it through the grapevine, we could have a prepared presentation for them and take them through the highlights very quickly. And then also being involved in demos. So in the product world, it's exciting that we get to usually a clickable prototype or some piece of content or something that's very show and tellable, so to speak. And that goes a long way in demonstrating the effectiveness of using design thinking and using processes like these. And then it was helpful for us to be polished. So the presentation materials we had were all prepared beforehand, so we didn't have to scramble at the last minute to talk about these things. We also made a highlight reel of what our users said when we showed them a version of our prototype. And things like that were a good way of communicating very quickly the effectiveness of these methods. And then through our workshops, we wanted to take people through this process that's often used in medical schools, which is like see, do, teach. So the first time you see something, so we would talk them through what the process was. And then the second time, actually have them do the process. And then third, give them the tools to be able to teach them and share that out with their teams so that they had the templates that they needed and they had the tools and the materials necessary to spread this kind of work out. And this also helps us overcome any sense of like ownership bias or some sort of like territorialness about the work, because our job isn't to own design thinking within the organization as design strategists. Our job is to evangelize design thinking throughout the organization. So we're looking for converts. We're not looking for like credit at the end of the day that we are owning the design thinking process. And then after each of these projects, we want to collect feedback, reassess our priorities. So with that idea of a portfolio of different initiatives, we want to see if something's become more important or less important, then prioritize that based on the resources available. And then finally, taking this approach of treating each initiative like an experiment. So it isn't this must succeed project where if it doesn't work exactly as planned, then we feel terrible afterwards, but rather it's an opportunity for us to collect data on how the organization as a whole is responding to the work, what seems to be easy to do, what seems to be difficult to do, and what we can do better to adapt to the conditions within the organization to help people learn about design thinking more easily. And then, of course, this is the typical agile method of build, measure, learn. So the more of these initiatives we do, the more we learn about how we can do initiatives better and we can talk about them better. And then that also improves our process as we do this throughout the organization. And then finally, just a couple of notes in that, just like any product design or any kind of design, there's a lot of other dependencies on whether you end up succeeding. So finding product market fit. So in our case, the product market fit is the success of spreading design thinking through the organization depends on a couple of things like the experience of the designer. The more cycles that we have, the more experience that we have, the likelier it is that we'll know how to adapt to changes and the likelier it is that we'll succeed. The expertise and the creativity of the designer, obviously also. So what we bring to the table in terms of how well we can think our way out of problems, the support of leadership, and then finally external conditions. So depending on what is happening in the marketplace, or depending on whether we can build something because we have engineers or we don't have engineers, can also affect the success of all of these things. And it's just good to be cognizant of this so that it's not so much pressure on just the design strategist or the designer to take every bit of credit or every part of the blame. There are so many different components to seeing whether an initiative succeeds or doesn't. Okay, and that's the end of the show. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
That's great, Jayesh. Thank you, and thank you everyone in NoVA UX for posting your question. We have 3 here, and we're thinking about actually opening up as an open Q&A. So I'll start with the first 3 questions, and for folks that are interested in asking Jayesh directly, we can have an open forum, almost a little fireside chat with Jayesh directly here.
And I just opened up the group, so if
Awesome.
you want to turn the video on, camera on, join us, have at it.
Great. So first 3 questions. First one from Carl Kaufman. Hey, Jayesh. Do you look to balance the triangle of product management? I guess it's when you were talking about the double diamond, and that was referring to the triangle of product management.
Yes. So the by the triangle, are you referring to the desirability, feasibility, viability piece?
Absolutely. I know something we often have to do at my organization.
Definitely. So I look to balance it, but definitely the place that I need to put most of my weight on is the desirability. So usually there are folks within the organization who are really incentivized and motivated to make sure that A, it works, and B, it'll sell. But it's really important for design strategists and designers in the places that I've worked to really emphasize what impact this has, or anything that we do has, on the user experience. So yeah, I look to balance it, as in I think it's usually unbalanced where desirability is not given enough attention, and I try to push, I try to like sit on that side of the seesaw more.
Thank you.
Great question, Carl. Next question from James Gleason. What do you think are important considerations when applying design thinking to a somewhat mature product or service rather than a new product or service? for the designers or for the stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's an interesting thing because the way that I've always used design thinking in my career is that it can be applied and abstracted to all sorts of problems. I think when it's a new product, obviously the scope is a lot greater at the beginning, where you are, when you're thinking about the way you're going to solve user problems, you can really think of very different solutions that might have different features. Whereas if it's a mature product, maybe you're actually looking to optimize that product, or maybe you're thinking of re-envisioning that product, but you have a lot of information about your user. So the time spent doing certain activities can be different, or the amount of attention you give to the details can be different. So when I've worked in startups and we were just trying to figure out how do you help, for example, someone deposit checks in their bank account faster, the problem is defined very clearly. And so you can dig into specific things like what in your day prompts you to forget to deposit a check, or when do you have to deposit checks, and what kinds of things do you hate doing when it comes to checks. Whereas if you're trying to just build a new financial services company, and it could be anything from giving you advice about retirement to how to save better, you have to spend more time learning about your users, and you have to try out sort of broader concepts because you don't know exactly what part of the problem you're going to work on, if that helps.
Good for me. Thank you, Jayesh. Next question from Lara Nike or Niche. What are some of the ways you measure success with your initiatives?
Yeah, for sure. So a couple of them are quantitative. Would love to get feedback. So when we did that whole design strategy summer camp experience, after each of the workshops, all of the folks who joined were able to give us feedback on a survey of what they liked about it, if they learned something from it, would they take away anything useful from it. And that was helpful. We also like to see if, so one of the ways that's not as measurable, but is very exciting when it actually happens, is if somebody else in a different part of the organization tells you about something that they heard about an initiative that you worked on, or they talk about someone who worked on a team with you taking a method that you taught them and applying it to a different project. So that is the sort of sign of it being a sustainable initiative, where people are interested enough in it and are benefiting enough that they independently decide to apply it to different things.
That's great. Thank you, Jayesh. And the next question, in fact, I was going to call, so Robert just posted it. Robert, do you mind asking a question to Jayesh directly?
Yeah, hi Jayesh, I'm Robert, good to meet you.
Hi, good to meet you.
My question was, how do you go about mitigating the risks that are inherent to design work through customer-facing tests, if you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I think generally in the product design space, so when we're working on a specific product, we're very lucky at CNN that we have access to lots of different ways of validating our hypotheses. So we can do concept tests, we can do qualitative testing, and we can do surveys, and also do lots of like usage tests. I think, but beneath that question though, there is a bit of education that needs to happen on what we are looking to answer and what is our level of confidence. And so I always try to level set as to this is what we're trying to figure out. And this is based on how many people we spoke to, or based on how many people we asked to interact with this. This is our best guess at what will make them happy or what will be successful. So it doesn't end up, because it can devolve into this sort of A/B analysis paralysis, where you're just doing a lot of tests and there are hundreds of thousands of data points and you look for statistical significance, but it kind of misses the point of, are you just trying to tell if you should make this change because you're confident enough? And I think having those conversations earlier on can make that easier. Or even that classic question that I'm sure I'm going to keep getting asked until the end of my career of, was that a representative sample? And it's like sometimes you're not looking for a representative sample. Sometimes you're looking for the extreme cases because they can tell you things more easily. Or sometimes you're looking to speak to a few people so that inspires your creativity about what problems you could be solving rather than doing a survey of the whole country.
That's great. Thank you.
For sure.
We have an anonymous DM question. Any strategies or ideas what to do if you encounter resistance to design thinking?
That's a great question. It's interesting. So there are a couple of strategies that I've applied or I've seen other people also use these. So one is that the design thinking process, when stripped of its terminology, is very intuitive. Like it makes sense logically that you want to study the people you're building for and that you want to spend time figuring out what's really going on and that you want to come up with ideas to solve it. And so sometimes it's an issue of terminology where if the resistance is like, well, this sounds strange or it isn't a part of my process, to then reframe it in those terms of like, we are trying to answer this question or we're trying to get some confidence for a hypothesis. So that's part of it. I think that's one thing. Another thing that we used to sometimes experience is people are very uncomfortable with the uncertainty in the first phase where you don't sometimes know the problem you're going to be solving because you're studying your user, and that can feel uncomfortable because you want to be able to have like a specific path already. And with that, there's a couple of things we can do. So with the workshops, we would sometimes give people a crash course in the whole process over the course of a morning or an afternoon so that they have a sense of what it looks like afterwards, so that they can see that after this uncertainty, usually there's some insight that comes out. So it isn't just unknown about what happens next and what happens after that. Or if there are folks who are evangelists on the team, so people who've done the process before and have more confidence in it, get them to talk about it so that it isn't just someone external coming in and saying, hey, here's a brand new way of thinking about doing work. It's coming from a peer who has a lot more credibility as a partner. Yeah, that's a great question.
I have a question. So when we're talking about easy design and you want to like measure that scale, like at what point does it become a dark pattern? Does it sometimes become like too easy? Or is that ultimately the goal, would you say?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think there should be a talk on that because design ethics, I think, is an under researched part of this whole thing. Like we've spent a lot of time as designers trying to figure out how to make things easy and how to make things habitual. And we haven't spent as much time thinking about when things should be habitual and when users should be broken out of habits. So I think part of it comes from one, like always having the user's interests in mind. So whenever I was working on behavior change stuff, it was always helping users with a behavior that they wanted to do. So not coercing them into something that they didn't think of or didn't want. That's part of it. But another part of it that's reassuring for me is as I get to work with more Gen Z users, we have used so many dark patterns in the apps that we've built that they've kind of become immune to a lot of it. And they see it as a turnoff when they see apps notifying them in a way that they can tell is designed to engage them more. So hopefully users are getting savvier as well, which will take us away from just using easy ways and taking advantage of cognitive biases. But yeah, I think as designers, we got into this business to help people or to make something better. We should always have the user's interests in mind when we're thinking of ideas.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
For sure.
We have a question from Aldridge. Jayesh, how do you manage a stakeholders communication if they don't really care about design or UX? Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. So part of the studying the organization as a designer has to do with figuring out what the motivations of each of the different groups and users are. So our users in this case, would be people who work in different parts of the organization. And it's very important to figure out what their incentives are. So are they concerned about the financial success of the product, or are they concerned about having this group funded for a long time, or are they concerned about making sure that there's good work-life balance for their employees, or whatever the case may be. And they don't have to care about the UX or aesthetics, but design thinking, ultimately, the goal of it is to make a better product for our users so that we have more success in the marketplace and that we create more engagement and we have higher satisfaction. All of that should translate into some metric that each person within the organization cares about. So they don't have to care about even the financial success, but some metric that you can translate that into that does matter to them can make that conversation easier.
That's great. Thank you, Josh. It's definitely the relatability and the value that we create, right? So that's cool. And this is actually kind of a follow-up question from Carl. You mentioned he had to step away, but how do you respond to criticism of the design thinking process? You even hear a lot from within the design community. So it's somewhat related, but I think maybe you can kind of lead that into from the UX community standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. So I think two fundamental things that I've always followed is design is about doing and design is an iterative process. So the more feedback that you get, the more informed you can be. And so like part of being a designer is being okay with critique and being able to take in what, value critique brings. So if there are alternative ways of doing things, or if there are better ways of doing particular steps in the design thinking process, that's just great feedback. And wherever we can evolve and do better on, that's all like positive stuff in the end.
Excellent. I think that covers the questions we've had so far. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask Jayesh?
I'd ask another one if I'm audible.
Sure, please.
So I'm just sort of wondering about the overlap of agile methodologies and design thinking and the meshing of those two together, because I've encountered a lot of difficulty sort of making those work together. And I wonder if you have any, recommendations for how to merge agile development methodologies and design thinking together.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's an interesting sort of evolution that happens when we first learn a methodology. That first, it tends to be very textbook and very focused. And as we apply it to more things in our space, we make adjustments based on how we like to work and what we've seen work and hasn't worked. Where I think the area, so I've worked on agile teams a lot, and the sort of pain point for them that I try to add or make better is specifically around doing enough user research and doing enough synthesis. So they sometimes will have concerns about spending a lot of time doing discovery, because why don't we just try something out and see if it sticks or see if it fits. And there is that's the biggest friction point usually, where when I'm managing projects, I try and say we're just in discovery camp for this specific amount of time, whether it's 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and then we can really try out lots of different things and see how well they work. But I want us to be confident about our ideas based on what we know about our users before we start getting into that iterative cycle. So that's a conversation. Sometimes it ends up being like a difficult conversation, but I think usually folks, once they try it out, it's a lot of fun to actually dig into user needs and to learn learn about our people when we build for them.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Okay.
Any other questions anybody would like to ask?
I have one really quickly. So I'm just curious if you have, I know there's a ton of opportunity in this area, but have you ever personally worked with design thinking in the public sector side of the house? So whether it's government or it's healthcare or, you know, whatever it may be, it just kind of falls into a different space of functioning. And I know that can
Yeah.
have its own difficulties. So I'm curious if you had any insight there.
For sure. I have a little bit of experience, not a lot of experience, but I've done some work with NGOs using this kind of methodology. And typically the kinds of things that we adjusted or modified were, instead of looking at viability from a strictly financial lens, we were looking at it from a social impact lens. So we added sustainability as part of what we were optimizing for. The first part of the process was the same in that we identified the stakeholders or the people that we were designing for. And in these cases, it was designing programs rather than designing a product. But understanding, again, what their needs were, what was unmet, mapping out their journeys, and then coming up with program solutions for them. And then in terms of implementation, the deliverables were, of course, different. So it ended up being much more like learning and development materials or training materials for the folks who would be implementing it. And then also recruiting guidelines. So if we were going to recruit field workers, what were, like, how should their first 30 days look? So what were the characteristics they should have at the beginning? What kind of training should we give them? And then making sure that they're up to speed and that they're able to do what we need them to within 1 month. And then also putting in a culture of getting feedback from the field and then changing things on the fly. Like as they learn, as they work with the groups that they're supposed to, how they can become comfortable making changes to the program or suggesting changes to it. So that was the only case, but it's still, the general philosophy seemed to work pretty well. And it was just more focused on what are the products in this case that we need to build to have a successful program.
Thank you.
For sure.
We'll do one final question from James Gleason. Your favorite 6th Street restaurant in East Village?
If it's 6th Street, this is the hardest question of the night. I don't know if it's on 6th Street. There's a restaurant called Mokyo, which does this Korean tapas thing, and I think they might be on 7th. I don't know. Also, Abrazo is a really nice coffee bar, but I don't know if they're on 7th too. So I'm sorry, this one I'm going to have to plead the 5th.
Good effort.
Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, Jayesh. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thanks everybody for the fantastic questions. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. I'll also love to mention that NoVA UX is a community sponsor of the Savvy UX Summit 2021, which is next month. It's a virtual event, the 17th through the 19th of September. The seats are getting pretty limited. So if you want to check them out, you can go to savvyuxsummit.com, which is at the, oh wait, I'm going to post it to everybody who's still here. Here we go. So check that out. Next month's meetup will be featuring Eve Penzi-Moog, who will be talking about considerations designers should keep in mind when designing for safety in product experiences. And her book, Design for Safety, is available on A Book Apart. If you are interested in giving a talk or a workshop or a panel or something like that for NoVA UX, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out to one of us. We'd love to discuss. I believe we're currently booked almost through December for this year, which is pretty awesome. So we're going to actually be scheduling events for 2022, if you can imagine. Thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to log in this evening. Have a fantastic rest of your night, and we will see you all very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jayesh.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks,
everyone.
Josh.
Thanks all.
Thank you.